So the big part about a pure tact is that it's a nonverbal SD that results in a response that has some sort of generalized reinforcer. That is sort of the traditional verbal behavior definition. But if we think about it, that pure tact, that nonverbal SD with a response, that's not something that we're typically doing regularly. Like, when was the last time you walked into a room and just saw a chair and said chair? Typically, if we're labeling, it's an interverbal tact. So this is a tact that is controlled both by a verbal stimulus, the question, as well as the visible object. So for example, what color is it and the car both are required to evoke the response blue. It's not just that nonverbal stimulus. So this is a result of convergent and divergent multiple control. So convergent control is where multiple stimuli have control over a single response, and divergent control is a single variable evokes multiple responses. So for example, what color is evoking blue, yellow, red, all different color responses, whereas this image of the green ball is evoking ball, round, small, green. But it's that convergent control between both the question, what color, and that stimuli that's resulting in the response, green. So when we think about teaching questions, we often are teaching this as a basic tact. We're teaching them, you hold up the stimuli, you say, what is it? And they're labeling it. But we don't always know whether or not it's coming under convergent control, both the question and the item, or if it's just single control of that nonverbal stimuli. So how do we assess that that's happening? Because for a lot of our learners, it can be really easy to miss when we have faulty stimulus control and they're just responding based on the nonverbal stimuli instead of both the question and the stimuli. So to test tact discrimination, there's a couple ways you can do it. I like putting out an array of stimuli, but you can just gather a stack of mastered stimuli. And you're going to hold up the picture and you're going to ask 1 to 2 mastered questions about that picture. And your learner should be able to answer any mastered question about that picture. This is a really good way to test whether or not the responding is being controlled by just the object or picture, by just the question, or by both sources of control. So what can this look like? So the basic version of this is a 2 or 3 element component discrimination. So object versus color. So like, what is it versus what color, or an agent versus action versus location. So who is it? What are they doing? Where are they? So what this could look like if you have an array, you put out these 4 pictures, assuming your learner knows their colors and they know how to label all of these things. You should be able to go down the line and say, what is it? What color? What color? What is it? What color? Asking at least both questions about at least one of those stimuli. Often what you will see for learners, even though they know how to label all of these items and they know their colors, no problem, when you do it back to back in this kind of way, you'll see everything is just the item name. That it might just be, they might just say cat, car, apple, fish, cat, as opposed to being able to flip between the questions. Or sometimes you'll see they're guessing that even though they can do it 100% fluently on its own, when you put it in discrimination, sometimes sometimes you lose that they aren't able to actually properly do it as fluently as they could. An example of how you might do this with action pictures. So again, 4 pictures of known people with known actions, and you're just going to say, what is she doing? What is she doing? Who is it? What is he doing? Who is it? And again, you could also include where are they in there if that's something that they've mastered as well. But this should be something that if your learner is able to label their actions, label people, and label locations, that they could do fluently. But a lot of times the clients can't. That even though they have these skills, when you try and put it together and do it quickly in this order, they are not actually able to discriminate the questions. But say you have a learner, they can do that. The next difficulty would be property of objects questions. This is where you're going to ask multiple questions about the same object. So this would be for a learner that's learned their parts and features, that knows their class, that knows their functions. Can you put up a picture like this and be able to ask, What is it? What sound does it make? What color? What does it have? What do you do with a car? What is a car for? What is a car? Again, a lot of our learners, they've learned all of these skills and they can do it no problem when it's separate, when we're just focusing on one skill at a time. But when you try and put it all together and intermix it, it often will fall apart. And again, assuming your learner could do that, when we get to two-element questions about simple and complex scenes, this is where we often see that discrimination fall apart as well. So this is where we're asking questions about the agent, the action, location, prepositions. So for example, in this picture, where are they? Who is cooking? What is mommy doing? What is mommy stirring with? Where is the glass of milk? What is in the frying pan? What color are the flowers? Again, our learners should be able to, if they have mastered all of these skills, answer these questions fluently. But oftentimes what we see is when we put this stuff together, it falls apart because the learners aren't paying attention fully to all the components of our questions, that they're attending too much to just that nonverbal stimuli, what they see in the picture, or their reinforcement history. We've just been talking a bunch about actions, so probably this next question is an action. So as I said, some of the common errors we see is labeling the item regardless of the question. Sometimes you'll see this even before you ask the question, when you pull out the stimuli and then they start naming the actions, they start naming the item. You haven't even asked a question. That's a good indication that they're paying more attention to that nonverbal stimuli and not enough to the question. Sometimes you'll see compound answers. So mommy drinking. If I ask what they're doing, or what is she doing? They say mommy drinking, that's right. But then when I ask who is it and they still say mommy drinking, indicates that they're not actually paying attention to the differences in those questions. Also, sometimes you'll see them guess the response. So they might change their answer based on what was most recently reinforced, or just alternate and scroll through their answers, hoping that one of them will be right. So if we're seeing this, we can conclude that the question isn't properly under enough convergent control, that it's just that nonverbal stimuli or maybe only part of the question that's evoking the answer. So if we look at typical development, discrimination between multiple questions about the same object typically develops around 2.5 to 3 years, with increasing complexity as they build additional language and knowledge of other WH questions. But there is research that shows that there are persistent errors in autistic children around these interverbal tact conditional discrimination questions, that oftentimes even after their vocabulary has increased, they don't always develop this. So let's take a look at some of the ways we're traditionally teaching questions and question discrimination. So if we look at the ABLES labeling sequence, so we're teaching them to tag common objects, actions, features, function, classes, but there's no assessment of interverbal tags or question discrimination in the labeling sequence. When we get to the interverbal sequence, we're answering what, where, who, and when questions without any test of discrimination. It's not until age 30 in the ABLES-R that there's any assessment of discrimination of questions about items or activities. And this is where they're being asked to discriminate what, where, who, and when questions. But oftentimes by this point, they've already developed faulty stimulus control from other teaching if we haven't explicitly taught and assessed this discrimination. If we look at the VB map tacting sequence, again, we have 50 generalized tacts, 10 actions, noun-verb combinations. So we're teaching them to combine nouns and verbs without testing for their understanding or discrimination between those nouns and verbs. So example, we're teaching them mommy drinking, but do they understand the difference that mommy is a who question and drinking is a what action question? Again, it's not until tact 11M that there's an actual assessment of that discrimination between color, shape, and function. So this is something that if we're following these assessments, we may not be testing this until later. And oftentimes you find learners, they get to this point and then it starts to fall apart and they start to struggle with this discrimination. Okay, so how can we take this knowledge and apply it to how we're teaching language? I'm going to show you a way that can make teaching, establishing interverbal tactings more effective and efficient. So first of all, this isn't always necessary. We definitely have some learners that will naturally pick up on the verbal stimuli. They'll learn to interverbally tact without needing that explicit teaching, and that's great. But but it isn't always effective for all of our learners. And sometimes it's effective until it isn't. So again, sometimes the basic TAC training can fall apart when we start putting it together, or it requires a lot of time and repetition and multiple exemplars for them to develop this interverbal tacting in a way that if we use this other approach, we might not have to. Okay, so how do we avoid this faulty stimulus control? First, we want to make sure that we're testing for discrimination. So if we're only teaching skills in isolation, we may not notice problems until much later. So if we're not consistently testing whether or not they can do skills in discrimination with other mastered skills, we might not notice it when faulty stimulus control is developing. Another thing we can do is interspersing questions. So continually asking mastered questions about current stimuli. I love, oh, I see in the comments that things are frozen. I hope it's not my connection.
I think there was a small connection. Seems like there was a small connection lag on your end, but the audio and the video is back on my test one.
Back. Okay, perfect.
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so I'll just continue. If there was anything that you missed, just feel free to put in the chat. Otherwise, I'll continue going. Okay, so in terms of interspersing questions, I like to set my mastery criteria for current targets that you're continually, that like it's not mastered until you can do it in discrimination with the previously mastered target. So if I'm working on animal sounds, it's not going to master until they can also answer animal sounds in discrimination with what is it, being able to label the animals and, maybe what color the animal is. And also sometimes teaching interverbal tacting explicitly, so using them to teaching them to attend to those multiple stimuli, both the verbal SD and the nonverbal SD, can help with both the efficiency of it and helping those learners that aren't naturally picking it up on their own. So there's an autoclitic frames procedure that Dr. Degli Espinoza developed that we've been using for years that I have found incredibly effective. So we're going to go through that so you can learn. So hopefully you can understand and also want to take on this procedure. So, okay, what are autoclitic frames?